Thank you. Yes, I'm being reminded yet again to speak slowly. Not only am I not able to speak in Italian, but I'm also Scottish, and and according to my mother, I still mumble. So I will try my hardest not to. It's not so much that organizations, if we could have the slides up, please. It's not so much that I'm saying that organizations shouldn't tweet, but I wrote the book because I was concerned at what I thought we were losing over the last 10 or 12 years. I, like Mark and Paolo, have been involved in this thing for that long. For 12 years I've been blogging. And it began as a very personal, very low-key, very intimate thing. There was a very small group of us. We got to know each other very well. We felt at times as if we were having very direct and occasionally profound connection with each other. And then we get new platforms like Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. And for many, that's their first experience of this connected, networked world. But in essence, it's a very different experience. You then get corporations and organizations waking up to the potential of this new connected world. And they started to intrude into our space. And in fact, the title of the book came from a tweet that I wrote in reaction to the 140-character press releases that were suddenly starting to fill Twitter. That these corporations were coming into what I saw as a personal space and bringing with them attitudes about channels and markets and the sort of world of the press release, if you like, which seemed to me to be missing the point. So the book was written really for people who hadn't had the luxury that I'd had of being involved in this from the start, who were trying to catch up with what this meant and why it was interesting. And it was really written for people to give to managers in organizations who were wondering what the hell this was all about and why they should have anything to do with it. Part of the problem also surfaced yesterday for those of you who were here, which is the fact that we have industrialized so much of our lives. Our work lives, for many of us working in big organizations, have become industrialized. We have sold our souls in many ways in the name of security. We sign away all sorts of individuality in return for having the safety of a job. But of course that safety is becoming apparent isn't as safe as it used to be. But we're stuck in this mindset of having to give up things to go and work for an organization. The other aspect of industrialization is that we find it difficult to decide to do things ourselves. So I've been fascinated working with a whole range of different companies, how many managers don't actually do anything or decide anything themselves. They outsource things to consultants. So we've got this kind of weird, big model of big organizations where largely people are trained not to think for themselves and are unwilling to take the risk to do so. We're then applying that model to the social web. So we outsource being social to companies, to agencies. And many, many companies have ticked the digital box by getting an agency to do social for them. And it's still held at one remove. It's distant from them. It's distant from them as organizations, and it's distant from them as people. And I think part of this, and again this came out a little bit in the conversations yesterday, and talking to Marco this morning about the Italian culture, and some people have been explaining to me the Italian work culture, and the sort of deference to the patron and the sort of paternalistic organization that still exists to a large extent. And I tweeted last year that does deference matter more to those who are deferred to than those who do the deferring? In other words, is it more comfortable for us just to let the hierarchy and the management make all the decisions? And this used to be the case at the BBC where I used to work. You had this odd mixture, and it was interesting listening to Gigi's thing about creativity. You had this odd mixture of a very creative organization employing very creative individualistic people who then treated them as children and expected them just to play, if you like, and the grown-ups would make all the decisions. And I think in society generally we have, partly due to broadcasters, partly due to the media, again been trained to be passive in our entertainment, passive in our storytelling. We have subcontracted the storytelling to broadcasters. And I think, Mark was talking yesterday about the frustration of people playing in Facebook. Again, I think that's because we're treating Facebook as a place to play because we are children. Now, in fact, Facebook and all of these platforms have enormous potential for us to have grown-up conversations, for us to start to use the tools to talk about serious things and things that matter. But we seem unwilling to do so. And I think a lot of this is about finding our voice. And I can remember clearly, in fact, I still experience the nervousness about saying what I think that I did when I wrote my first blog post. And in fact, my blog is called The Obvious, because it was me overcoming my reticence about stating the obvious. Because I thought, everybody must know this. They will laugh at me for saying this. Or somebody will be cross with me for saying this. And that nervousness is doubly so in organizations. So I deployed at the BBC and now work with other companies to help them use social tools inside the firewall. And I never underestimate what I'm asking of people. I'm asking people to say what they think in writing in front of their whole organization. And in a very different way from our conventional business communication. Most of our business communication is depersonalized. It's written in management speak. It's written in language that takes the potency out of it. And as a consequence, frankly, doesn't achieve an awful lot. So I have people quizzing me about the return on investment or the business benefit of using tools like blogging or tweeting or whatever else. And I push back and say, well, you explain to me the business benefit of spending hours writing 40-page reports that nobody's going to read, that gets stored in some knowledge repository never to be read again. Whereas a well-written tweet or blog post can change the world. The other nervousness, I think, is with senior people. You see this with chief executives who have been encouraged by the communication department to have a blog. And I describe it as like watching your father dancing at a disco, where you're proud of him for having a go, but you'd really rather he stopped. So there's a whole raft of very personal issues about using platforms to talk to people and say what you think. But you need to think. And this is another thing I think we've become not so good at, is thinking seriously about work, about why we do what we do, what the consequences are of what we do. I find it funny that there are all these companies, accounting firms or consulting firms, who aspire to be thought leaders. But how can you be a thought leader if nobody knows what you think? And of course, the consequences of everybody in an organization thinking are not trivial. My ultimate fantasy is an organization where everybody blogs. Everybody thinks hard about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they write well about that. And other people read what they've written. And that exchange of ideas helps us to grow up and helps us to take responsibility for our organizations. So one of the chapters in the book I call The Ultimate in Democracy, where arguably, given this sort of power of large corporations, in many states our democracies are struggling to cope. What if you flipped the idea of democracy inside the firewall and you have lively networks in your organizations where everybody is taking responsibility and everybody is thinking hard about why you do what you do? If we'd had that kind of network inside some of the banks, maybe we wouldn't have been in the financial crisis that we're in now. Maybe enough small, quiet voices saying, are we really sure we should be doing subprime mortgages, might have prevented them happening. Some of the more outrageous activities of avaricious commercial organizations might not be got away with if staff are allowed to express their discomfort with what's being discussed. And there's a personal benefit to this that those of us who've blogged for a long time begin to experience. And David Weinberger once described it as writing ourselves into existence. It's almost a sort of therapeutic activity of pushing ideas out into the world and seeing what people's reactions to those are. And then you decide whether you've felt comfortable with the reaction or want to change as a result of the reaction, and then you try again and you write something else again. And you start to develop. It's like accelerated learning. The whole web for me feels like learning. Even the trivial bits are teaching me something. So again, back to Gigi's presentation, which I was initially nervous about following. I thought, goodness me, how on earth do I follow this? But actually, in many respects, it led into this nicely, because the shift in perspective, the moving away from the familiar scales and the comfort we have with our current dissonance will only happen if individuals start to go through this process of pushing ideas out and having them pushed back and pushing them out and getting them back. And once you've done this for a while, you start to leave patterns. Because this thinking is done in public and in a connected environment, it starts to leave paths and trails. So as an individual, leaving an organization as I did the BBC 6 years ago, I left my mark. In fact, it felt quite a wrench because I felt like I was leaving part of myself behind. Because of all my blogs that I'd written at work, all my forum posts, all my wiki pages, I had to leave behind. So organizations, again, talk all the time about knowledge retention and have horrible phrases like knowledge extraction or knowledge harvesting, which is my favorite, which sounds like some cerebral milking machine that sucks the good stuff out of staff's heads and then leaves the empty husks at the back door. And how we organize things, the conversation we had yesterday with Adriana and David about hierarchy or non-hierarchy. Once you have these networked conversational patterns in your organization, you have different ways of navigating. So what I think you begin to see is the equivalent of old villages that grow up through activity, through people building roads or building houses in a slightly random way. They're not predetermined architectural styles. They're decisions that are made locally and made over a long period of time. But they're very navigable because they're human. You can relate to them. In contrast, new towns are made to a proscribed plan. And there's a particular new town in the UK called Milton Keynes, which this is a photograph of. And I get lost every time I'm in Milton Keynes, even with a sat-nav, because I just can't relate to the logic that was there, which people thought would be obvious, but which still isn't obvious to me. And that's what most intranets are like. Most intranets and most corporate information systems are like Milton Keynes. They're overly structured, they're overly constrained, they're too tidy. Now, I think you get the benefit when you combine these two, when you overlay the two. You make your formal structured organizational information more lively and more accessible by having networked conversations around it. People fear having too much noise. There's too much rubbish on the internet. Why would we want that kind of rubbish at work? But part of what we've done over these years of becoming good at management is we've become good at tidying up, and we've tidied up too much. We've sanitized our work communications to such an extent that we've lost the signal as well as the noise. And if you're going to recover from that, you have to culturally get over the fact that people have to say things. They have to be encouraged to say things. Some of the things you think they're saying may appear to be rubbish, but if you disapprove of them, they will stop saying things. So I did a talk a couple of years ago that I called The Price of Pomposity. And that disapproving, who are you to say that? Or you shouldn't be saying that at work, or you shouldn't, that's not your job to say that. That all freezes us back into this minimal, tight, constrained, overly structured world. And this has consequences for management. Once more people discover this potential, this networked potential for thinking for ourselves and sharing our thoughts with each other, how does that affect the role of a manager? And many managers are still stuck in the command and control paradigm. They're stuck in the world of feeling they're in charge. And I remember that feeling very clearly in my first real line management job, where I was responsible for, well, even as I say it, it doesn't mean anything. I was meant to be responsible for 50 film and videotape editors. But how could I be responsible for people who had been in the business since before I was born, who were old enough to be my father? And I was terrified at this responsibility. So I started wearing a tie and talking funny. I started acting like I thought a manager should act. And then thankfully I realized that I was on a slippy slope that I didn't want to go down. And I saw many of my colleagues who just got lost in that world of wearing a tie and talking funny and talking management speak. But if you wade into these online networked worlds with that kind of attitude, it will just push you back out again. So back to some of Adriana's points, in these networks you are a node in the network. And your power and influence is as strong as your credibility with those you're speaking to. And the old adage that real leaders have followers has never been truer than in these networked environments. If your job title doesn't mean anything to me and you come into my forum or my blog network or whatever else and you just add platitudes, then I'm going to ignore you. And I'm going to find people who do add value. So I think generation of managers are waking up to the fact that they don't have, this may be different in Italy, I'll accept that there are things that are more challenging here, but certainly in the UK and America, it's less and less easy just to rely on your title, on your authority to get things done. You have to persuade people. It's almost like an internal PR job that you have to become good at selling compelling ideas to other people. You have to be good at having productive conversations with other people and going to people where they are and helping them to come to where you want them to be. And again, we talked yesterday about hierarchies and some of the issues around that. And I don't believe hierarchies disappear. I think there is something in human nature that will always perceive some as higher up some particular ladder than others. But I hope what we can move towards is what I describe as ephemeral meritocracies. So in other words, you are given status and authority, you're conferred authority by being particularly useful or having particular insights or particular value at a particular time. But don't expect to sustain it unless you continue to add that value. Or if somebody becomes more current, more effective, more useful, expect to be moved out of that post quicker. Because I think what goes wrong with our hierarchies in work is that we institutionalize them and we solidify them and we get HR involved and this whole bureaucratic process freezes the thing. And then we deploy tools like SAP or SAP to manifest that in software and hardware. Our corporate IT systems, to go back to that point from Microsoft, manifest that structured, rigid job-titled world in tangible, hard stuff that then seems impossible to move. And that's why we find it so hard to react to change. So I think there's an advantage in attempting to be strategically tactical. Again, Dave was taking the mickey out of people who claim to write 3-year, 5-year plans. I don't think anybody ever really believed that process. But have a process, have a strategy of tactically responding to the world as it presents itself to you so that you can react more quickly and have agreed principles that allow you to do so. And do so incrementally, smaller steps. The mice are there because a lovely analogy I once heard of Trojan mice. So rather than the big Trojan mouse, you have lots of big Trojan horse, you have lots of Trojan mice, small things that go off, that are self-contained, that gradually over time allow you to change. And again, to Adriana's point about having something central that allows the whole thing to hang together, like IP does on the internet. I've always liked this phrase from the American Marines, which is keep moving, stay in touch, and head for the high ground. Which I think makes eminent organizational sense. Have a rough idea of where the high ground is, keep doing things, and keep talking while you're doing it. So I can imagine an organizational setting where you have a succession of these small core aphorisms that allow you to deal with the complexity that you're facing without having to over-systematize it. Part of what's forcing this change on organizations is the fact that the outside is changing faster than they are. And increasingly the inside is the outside. People ban Facebook and LinkedIn, but people are able to then go home, and when you're at work or when you're at home is becoming a very blurred line. And where the responsibility of the individual lies in relation to their organization is becoming unclear by the day. So instead of worrying about that, why not take advantage of it? Why not encourage the inside to become the outside? Having got confident and capable and finding your voice inside your organization, what about starting to exercise it outside the organization and starting to talk more in public about what you do and why you do it as an organization? And I think this will begin to do really interesting things to brand. Because at the moment, brand means this perfect, paid-for, fiercely defended image of an organization that increasingly none of us believe. It doesn't make you more trustworthy. If anything, it makes us more nervous about you because there's this perfect thing that's being presented to us. So what's interesting for me at the moment is I have some senior people in some big organizations who are realizing that, as I say, they have paid others to make this social thing go away. And they're realizing now that it's more complicated and more interesting than that. And are taking me seriously when I suggest, why don't you allow your specialists, your clever people, your passionate people, to become visible to the outside world? So, like an oil company could allow their environment specialists to talk in public, to become visible to the public, to be able to build relationships and networks with people who are currently very antagonistic and critical of them. So just loosen those boundaries between the inside and the outside and allow your staff to take collective responsibility for the business. The last chapter in the book is actually a blog post that I wrote when I left the BBC. And it was partly in reaction to, again, a quote from David Weinberger, where he said that love is what makes the internet hang together. Not IP, not HTML, but the basic human desire to want to connect with each other, to want to be part of something connected, which at the moment for many manifests itself in the potentially trivial conversations on Facebook. But actually I think it's got a direct business consequence, a direct business benefit. Most businesses start because somebody cares about something, because somebody wants to make something better. The sort of stuff Mark's talking about in the States getting back to that thing of doing something worthwhile and being passionate about it. And I think that that's the exciting prospect that we have been given really with this technology, is to grow up, find our voices again, and actually care about stuff. And call me an aging hippie, make the world a better place. Thank you.